Do you think Hollywood can get Chicanos and Zoot Suit right? Ever?
It was a secret fantasy for Vivato, living in or out of the Pachucada, to put on the Zoot Suit and play the myth. Más chupote que la chingada. Pues órale!
Pues órale! What do you say we burn Hollywood down for a second? For a couple minutes. Let's burn it all down.
5, 4,
3,
1.
Pablito back here on the slant, the Latino slant, the Chicano slant. Slantity slant. Ow! Make sure you are subscribed. Hey, why not for Christmas get a Latino slant mug at our merchandise store? I think it sounds great. It's a great gift. Look, I can drink stuff out of it. Make sure you are a member. Please subscribe. 2021 is going to go down as the year of Latino musicals. Vivo, In the Heights, Encanto, West Side Story, Zoot Suit. With individual complaints about each production, marketing of Hollywood, bad Spanish accents galore in South America over Encanto, I'm not surprised. Hollywood can never really get us right. But there's this great story of these people in the 40s. It's an American story. In fact, it's called an American original, Zoot Suit. And in 1981, I believe, they filmed the teleplay version starring Edward James Olmos. There is a renewed talk, well, really probably in, people in my circles, of how can we remake faithfully Zoot Suit. So I don't want to do this alone. I've bringing in filmmaker Kenneth Castillo, and we're going to bring up this article from the Daily Chela. But let's say hello to, the metal himself. What's up, handsome?
Hey, what's going on, brother? How you doing?
You ready?
Absolutely.
And at a release time, how are the Raiders doing, Holmes?
The Raiders are doing well. We just beat Dallas on Thanksgiving. So
Look at you.
That was pretty nice. We're 6-5. We're still in the hunt.
Hey, man, you got to take it where you can.
Absolutely.
So, Zoot Suit. What's your early memory of Zoot Suit, the play and the film?
I think my earliest memory was I rented it at a video store. I think I was 10 or 11. And wow. I saw the cover and I just thought, it was Edward James Olmos as El Pachuco, and he looked incredible. And I remember asking my dad what this was, and he said, "Oh, you should get that. But it's a musical. It's a play." And I didn't know how they would film a play or whatnot, but I was entranced by the character on the cover. And my dad was explaining to me, about the Zoot Suit riots, and this happened. So, so of course I watched it, and, it wasn't in the day of the internet, obviously. So then I remember going to Encyclopedia Britannica, because we had Encyclopedia Britannicas, and looking it up.
We were in that essay?
What's that? We were
in that?
In that for like this much.
Hey, we'll take it.
Yeah, so I couldn't really find a lot of information. I started looking up, going to the library and finding things, and I mean, that's just, as a filmmaker, it was probably my first musings. The first discipline I had as a filmmaker was in terms of researching things that I didn't know much about and finding the truth of them. And so as in doing that, there was a Zoot Suit culture in San Pedro and Wilmington where I grew up. So I kind of had that ownership of, I kind of enjoyed that part of it, and then I realized, putting two and two together, like, Luis Valdez had the same guy who did La Bamba. This is after I've discovered Zoot Suit after La Bamba, and putting those together and then it just stops. After La Bamba with Luis Valdez. But as I became an actor later, I was doing. We were doing some of his plays at the acting academy that I went to. My wife directed Los Vendidos, which is a one act that Luis Valdez wrote.
Nice.
So that's how I became familiar with it.
Yeah. Well, there's, like I said, this year, 2021, a lot of Latino musicals that came out, animated, live action, by Latinos, by non-Latinos.
Which is usually the case.
Big budget, big, releases. And yet there's a lot of, there's been some clamor and fuss. But, all of those stories don't have what Zoot Suit has, which is it was a true American story.
No, I think you're right. And I love that you said it's a true American story, because that's exactly right. It is an absolute American story, and there's so much going on for Chicanos during that time. And we have yet to see anything really depicted in film and television of that time of Los Angeles. But where we live in Los Angeles, we're not. There isn't a lot of history that's kept here, even including like the architecture. Things are just tore down and rebuilt here, where if you go to Chicago or New York, you see their history in their architecture. So a lot of it gets lost, and it's hard to recreate a 1940s Los Angeles. Maybe you have a couple of blocks you can do that in, but in terms of doing something like Zoot Suit on the scale of not even West Side Story, but in the Heights, you're talking a pretty big budget if you were going to give it the respect that it deserves.
Well, let's bring up the article, because there's so many questions I want to ask. We're going to do a video on this article, and then we're going to get together with other people in the biz and have a long talk about this, as to even this could happen. But this kind of sparked our talking to each other about this on Twitter. Celebrating Zoot Suit by Luis Valdez by Alexander Ibarra on the Daily Chela. As an aspiring director and self-identified Chicano, I've always thought our 4 Chicano films should be placed on the Mount Rushmore of Chicano films. I'm not saying these are the best Chicano films, but they're the most influential and well-known of the Chicano genre. Those films are El Mariachi, Selena, Stand and Deliver, and Zoot Suit. I already have a big problem with those 4, but
I do too as well.
But that's not the point of the story.
Right. I would put La Bamba in there. He doesn't have La Bamba in there.
Or Blood and Blood Out.
And I would include El Mariachi. El Mariachi was shot in Mexico.
El Mariachi is not really a Chicano, genre at all.
Yeah, I love it. I love the movie, but I wouldn't consider it a Chicano film.
I would keep Selena, Stand Deliver, of course, Zoot Suit, then add Blood and Blood Out and La Bamba.
Absolutely. Bamba should definitely be in there.
Yeah, the story goes on to say, directed by Luis Valdez, Zoot Suit tells the story of Henry Reina, who, along with his Pachuco friends, is wrongfully accused of a murder in the 1940s. Los Angeles, while being guided and taunted by the surrealist figure El Pachuco, played perfectly by another Chicano pioneer, Edward James Olmos. The movie is loosely based on the Sleepy Lagoon murder trial, in which a group of 17 young Mexican men were detained and arrested for being suspects in the death of Jose Gallardo Diaz, who was found unconscious in Sleepy Lagoon in Commerce, California. The event would become a precursor to the Chicano movement, as the 17 Mexican men were racially profiled in their arrests. The reason for their arrest was due to the officers believing that the cause of murder was gang-related. The infamous Zoot Suit riots soon followed the trial. The Zoot Suit riots were separate from this. So, any thoughts right there so far on what we've read?
No, I think this is a pretty good, synopsis in terms of the movie and what it's about, where it takes place, the time frame. I always found it interesting about the Zoot Suit riots, particularly in the 80s, where it was a lot easier to get race. Well, you would still see racial profiling based on what we wore. Where there was like the white t-shirts and the Dickies and the socks up. But what I found interesting about this time was here you have Chicanos like dressed in full suits and are still considered gangsters. And it just kind of reiterated the fact that it's not the suit, it's not what we wear, it doesn't matter. They're profiled because they were Chicano, not because of what they were wearing, or maybe they hated the fact that there was that was what identified them, but there were a lot of Chicanos that were in the military and in the Navy during that time. And that was when there was the riots between the Zoot Suiters and Navy servicemen in downtown Los Angeles. So I pretty agree with everything he said so far, with the exception of the list of his Chicano films.
I would also like to add two big important elements as to this being uniquely American, is that Zoot Suit in this story it's there in their language and how they talk to each other. They being young Mexican Americans, Chicanos, they weren't even called Chicano. They weren't even calling themselves Chicanos, maybe Chucos or Pachucos. And the fashion, just like you said. And of course, the cars later on, probably late 40s and the 50s. But it's so like, it's just, they wore it on their sleeve, man. Their culture.
Oh, absolutely. And there was a pride in that as well, and I think that's what was bothering people at that time, where here were, like you said, they didn't call themselves Chicanos back then, but young Mexican American men and women that were identifying their self through their own style. That wasn't, and that was one of the other things I remember reading historically, was that this is a time where resources were scarce. And so the fact that these suits required so much fabric that it was insensitive to be wearing that much fabric. But what they don't know is that these were oversized clothes taken from their dad's closet and then turned into and worn differently, and that was how it was created. It might have been only one suit that they had, but but that was offensive towards people during World War II, where things like any type of cloth or rubber or steel was at an all-time low.
Let's continue now. Let's talk about the film. While the film is celebrated for its experimental use of long, continuous takes and fourth wall breaks, at its time of release, it wasn't as celebrated. The film received mixed reviews due to the format of using narrative cinematic scenes blended with a staged production aesthetic. What does that mean to you?
Well, I mean, I would say that, and I don't know, this is way far back. We're talking 1980. I don't know what the financial landscape was for the production company that did it or the distribution company that put it out. But, when those types of decisions are made, it's usually budgetary, for the director. And so those things didn't bother me. I felt like it kind of came in and out of that. But I looked at it at the time, and I still kind of do as a creative choice. Knowing what I know behind the scenes as a writer-director, maybe those were choices that Valdez made because of budget.
I'm looking at here on their Wikipedia, and it says at that time they had a budget of $2.7 million. I don't believe that.
No, I don't either, because that seems like a lot for that time.
That is a lot of money for that time.
40 years ago. That is a lot of money for then. But it is.
Either way, they're hamstringed.
Oh yeah,
sure.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think it's not at that time. A lot of people don't realize, and this is a true fact. And this is when I talk about, we'll probably get into the distribution and marketing of things later. But just in terms of, if you looked at Zoot Suit, it ran when it first opened, and it was at the Pantages or the Mark Taper Forum. I can't remember which one it was, but it ran for over 2 years. And so essentially it was like, okay, let's move it to Broadway. Like, that was the natural move, was to take this to Broadway because of its popularity. And it closed after 2 weeks. It only was there for 2 weeks in Broadway. It did not connect with Latinos in New York. And I always found that interesting.
Yeah, that's a whole nother discussion, but you're right. The film critic Leonard Maltin called the decision a major distraction, yet from its costumes, set pieces, and music, this movie should have every right to be on the same level as other classics such as Sing in the Rain, West Side Story, and Sound of Music. Here is where the discussion is, right? Because I actually really disagreed. It's not on the same level.
Mm-hmm.
This particular movie production is nowhere near on the same level of Singing in the Rain, West Side Story, and Sound of Music. No way.
Mm-hmm.
The actual music and the story, of course, but this is a teleplay at best,
Yeah,
and
you're talking, and I think that was like the second time I saw it was on PBS. Like PBS used to play it,
yeah.
and yeah, I agree, and that's not the fault of the filmmaker per se.
No, not at all.
Yeah, and that's not what you're saying, but I think yeah, my thing is it could definitely be on that level in terms of story, in terms of the pageantry, in terms of theatrics, and in terms of story. I think I just said that, but yeah, it wasn't given its due, and that's it's a property to me that is ripe for a grander retelling of it.
So we had said also too, and this is images from the film, and really it's Luis being as creative as he humanly possibly could be with filming at the theater. And all hats off to him, but imagine that this movie, this subject matter gets the same treatment as the remake of West Side Story, a retelling of Romeo and Juliet, of a fabled friction between Irish and Puerto Rican gangs, right?
Yeah.
I mean, cinematically, that movie looks amazing. I haven't seen it yet, but cinematically, what if we could get that for Zoot Suit?
I mean,
what are your thoughts? And we'll wrap it up.
Well, it would be really challenging on two levels. One, I don't feel it's a Latinx film, and that seems to be the marketing label that Hollywood likes to put on films to get as many people as possible. So it's not. It's a Chicano film, and that actually translates all over the world. Not maybe all over our country, but definitely a big chunk of it in terms of the Southwest. I'm talking Texas, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and California. That's still a lot of Latinos that make up, 60% of the Latinx population that I think would support this film, plus the rest of the world if it's done right. You know what I mean? Like the story is the oppression of these characters is something the whole world can rally behind and really, get kind of wrapped up in this pageantry of Zoot Suit culture, and it might be something that I think the rest of the world, if it was given its due in terms of production budget and in terms of marketing, there's an actual very lively and pretty big following of Japanese that have really embraced the Chicano culture. You know what I mean? In terms of how they dress, in terms of the cars they drive. And some people have issues with that. They think it's appropriation. But my thing is like, it's them wanting to be a part of something that they deem, how do I say, it doesn't bother me. You know what I mean?
Well,
like
the Zoot Suit was an appropriation, Mexican. Yeah. Yeah. But you're absolutely right, because it is a global phenomenon. Even in South America, in Ecuador and Peru, the Chicano culture is like a huge deal. So, and it keeps growing. Right. So that's interesting. You say that the marketing nowadays is just Latinx. So maybe this maybe this
have to be more targeted. And I don't, and in terms of the casting, that's your other challenge, because we don't really have, the only director I can think of that would even be trusted with a multi-million-dollar budget would be a Robert Rodriguez. He's the only one. I mean, he's been around for 30 years, and he's still the only one that's been able to kind of break through and work on really big budget type films as a Latino director.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, I mean, that says something exactly. So that's the hard thing. I think there's a lot of people in old Latin Hollywood that would, are cringing watching this, or would cringe watching and say, no, of course, Luis Valdez should direct it. And that would be great. But the reality of this business is that Hollywood doesn't know who he is. They're not going to give him $40 million to do Zoot Suit. They're just not.
And they don't. Hollywood didn't give him the Cesar Chavez movie. They gave it to Diego Luna.
They did. That's a perfect example of a movie that, again, it wasn't given the budget that it should have been. They had $10 million to make that movie. which wasn't nearly enough for the scope that I applaud Diego Luna for trying. But anyone who watched that film, I think was disappointed, and I wasn't necessarily disappointed in Diego Luna. I was disappointed that he didn't get the resources that the story deserved.
So, Zoot Suit, we have to wrap this up, my friend. But I'm thinking, you know, of course, we're gonna do a big long panel discussion with some other friends, but you know, there's something very also rebellious about Chicanos and Zoot Suit that it would almost have to be independently produced, but with a high budget.
Yes, and that would be very difficult because we don't have. If you wanted to do Zoot Suit with George Clooney and Ben Affleck, then you could probably do
what?
That's
or Javier Bardem as
you don't
El Pachuco.
Yeah, Javier Bardem. I mean, he is definitely a draw, but we don't have it there. I mean, you can't name me one Chicano that can open a film #1 in the box office. There isn't one.
I think in a few years it could possibly be Xolo Maridueña. Then he would make a nice Henry Reina. He's got great vulnerability. He's Chicano. He's you know, his parents are, you know, from the movement. Like he's got the pedigree.
Absolutely.
and he's getting the name now.
Can he sing and dance? And because that's the other added thing. It's not Chicano actors who are really good, and they sing and dance really good too. Especially if you're coming up against if you're going to do something on the level of In the Heights or West Side Story, where you know the dancing and the singing is amazing. You know, I mean, I'm sure they you know, but that's gonna on a musical, that's got to be #1.
And that's another interesting point, because Hollywood and a lot of friends of the slant, a lot of you know, friends of Latino projects, they're like, well, why not cast Anthony Ramos, the lead of In the Heights? He's great, and he is amazing.
Yeah,
he's so East Coast. He's so, you know, he's, you know,
that because they did a stage production which they hadn't done at the Mark Taper Forum about 3 years ago. I don't know if you saw it.
I heard about that.
Yeah, me and my wife saw it, and the lead actor, I can't remember his name. I actually had seen him in this small troupe called the Urban Movement, or I can't remember the name of the troupe, but they were a theater troupe here in LA, but they're made mostly of East Coast actors.
Okay.
And the guy who played Henry Reina is an incredible actor. But yeah, it was still very East Coast, and that took me out of it, you know.
And then, of course, who could play El Pachuco? I mean,
well, I have an interesting take on El Pachuco. I think that El Pachuco you could do several different ways. It doesn't have to be one actor throughout. You know, it could change, and he's a ghost, and so you could, you're never going to find somebody that is going to bring as iconic energy to that part that Edward James Olmos did. So you can't even compete with it on that level. But what you can do is reinvent it, and which is why I think it'd be interesting to include an El Pachuca in it as well. You know, because Pachucas were a part of that culture as well, and are always, as any women are in these types of stories, are always regulated to the background. I think, and not to do it in a woke way, but just to recognize that, yeah, there were Pachucas there too, and why couldn't El Pachuco be La Pachuca and have different ages and different actors playing the same part throughout? I think that would,
you know, it'd be dope is that out of his tattoo, you know, like La Virgen, or you know, like, you know, one fine Heine like comes out of the tattoo, you know.
That would be dope. Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think maybe you keep the costume the same, but you can change the actor so there's continuity with the character. But every actor or actress is in the same costume throughout. They don't have to be one actor. And I think you would have to get really creative with that character, because the power of Edward James Olmos performance as that character would overshadow.
Yeah, you can't even try. You're absolutely right. That's a great take. Well, Holly, if you're paying attention, hire Kenneth Castillo, writer and director. Come on, let's do this for real. You know, you don't need to have affected accents and brown face makeup. We know people.
Yeah.
Kenneth, thank you so much. KennethCastillo.com. People can reach you. What's your website?
My site, just Google Kenneth Castillo. My site is being under construction right now. I'm revamping it, but they just Google Kenneth Castillo. They'll find me.
All right, brother. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, guys. Please comment because this is an interesting topic for sure. Have you seen Zoot Suit? Have you ever seen any type of production live? And have you seen the movie yet? I do recommend that you see the movie. Honestly, it's a fantastic, accomplishment that they even did this with the small budget that they had. All right, everyone.
Suggest just look it up because sometimes they do anniversary screenings of it all the time, and it's really great to see it with gente.
Yes, it is. All right, be well, everyone. We'll see you soon. Peace.
Come on, y'all. Come on, y'all. Come on, y'all. It's land.
Yeah, but isn't this the unplugged version? I don't know. I think it's the unplugged version.
All right, Paulie, let's go.